Good evening. My name is Drew Dixon, and I'm the operations manager for the Coolidge Corner Theatre. And I would like to thank you all for coming to this Q&A about the film Still Life in Lodz. And I would just like to introduce our moderator for tonight, Ariana Cohen-Halberstam, and I'll leave it up to her.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this Q&A today for this really, really fascinating film, and there's so much to talk about in it. So I'm so glad to be here with the film's director, Slawomir Grunberg, who is an Emmy award-winning documentary producer, director, and cameraman. He was born in Lodz and graduated from the Polish Film School in Lodz before emigrating to the United States in 1981. He has directed and produced over 45 documentary films spanning a broad range of topics and issues. In addition to Still Life in Lodz, they include Karski and the Lords of Humanity, which screened here in Boston in 2016, Castaways, The Parrotsnicks, which I have a feeling may come up in this conversation, The Portraits of Emotion, coming out in Poland, and many more. His film, A Community at War, aired on PBS stations and garnered an Emmy Award. Among his awards, Grinberg has received the Guggenheim Fellowship, the New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship, and the Soros Justice Media Fellowship. His credits as a director of photography include Legacy, an Academy Award nominee for Best Documentary Feature in 2001, and Sister Rose's Passion, which won Best Short Documentary at Tribeca Film Festival in 2004, and received an Academy Award nomination for Best Documentary Short in 2005. An English edition of the book, Slawomir Grunberg, A Man with a Camera by Barbara Grinberg, will be published in April of 2021. So that's just next month. Lilka Elbaum, who any of you who have seen the film know well by now, was born in Lodz and graduated from the Jewish Parrott School. In 1968, she, together with thousands of Polish Jews, was forced to leave Poland, and she settled in Canada. She now lives in the United States in Massachusetts, and she is the daughter of Holocaust survivors Maria Copper and Benjamin Rosenbaum. For many years, she has researched the history of Polish Jewry, focusing on the Holocaust. Through her work and out of sentiment for the city and country where she was born, she maintains close ties to Poland. And finally, Paul Celler, who you will also know well if you've just seen the film, grew up in New Jersey, where he lived and worked for most of his life. He's the son of two Holocaust survivors, David Celler and Rosa Posalska. Paul finds meaning and grounding through kindness, his connection to family and community, the study of history, and his spiritual practice. He places a high value on tikkun olam, the Jewish concept defined by acts of kindness performed to repair the world. The surest ways he knows how to do that are by playing music and spending time with his wife, 3 children, and 3 grandchildren. The film Still Life in Lodz is in memory of Rosa and David Celler, who miraculously survived the Holocaust, and the 6 million men, women, and children who didn't. There's a lot to talk about in this film. I wish we had 2 hours because I would love to really get into it with you. But I'm going to start with a question which sort of frames the whole film, which is why objects, and which you refer to as objects of memory. How did you decide to, and I'll start with you, Slawomir, to structure this film around objects?
This idea of the film in the very first version came from Lilka. Lilka co-wrote a script with me, and the first version included just Lilka following her story of researching and discovering the painting. So the painting was from the very beginning the center of the film. Then the film changed. We added Paul and another character. So we have three characters in the film total, but the idea and the main structure was around memory, was about objects which we remember, we find in our memories from 50 years ago when we were in Poland, or our parents remember when they were in Poland. So through the film, I wanted to give audience a great room to unpack these memories, this history, and it is a return to Poland that excavates memories, and memories through objects, through items which we found, which we remember, which we bring with us, as Ronnie did. And this is the story. This is about touching these objects. This is about bringing back memories. This is about remembering and looking for roots through objects.
There's a really lovely, it's really well put, I think, by you, Lilka, in the film when you say I think it's the father's cufflinks, a mother's sugar bowl, a clock on the wall. These are sometimes the only, I don't know, I think the objects that are confirming that this world existed. And you explore the idea that the people are no longer there, but these objects remain, and we see these images of you in the flea market and someone holding a menorah, which is in a pile of other junk that's, you know, or these paintings that have no origin to them that we know of. You started this project through this painting. Did you know where this painting was the whole time? How did you find it again? How did this story come to you?
Well, you know, actually, the painting was, I didn't know where the painting was physically, but in 2016, I went to Poland, especially to Łódź. I've been to Poland hundreds of times since Poland changed its system, both, you know, because of business or just personal. And I never actually gone to Łódź that often, because Łódź always associated in my memories with the fact that we were asked to leave Poland as Jews. And, you know, for me, I was very young. I spoke English. I really should be very happy that I'm leaving this place. But for my parents, it was a terrible tragedy. My parents were Holocaust survivors. They both survived the Holocaust in Poland. What it was Poland, the territory of Poland, former territory of Poland. And my mother was saved by Polish Christians. My father also indirectly was saved by Polish Christians by hiding outside for 2.5 years. So for my parents to be thrown out of Poland 20 odd years after the Holocaust was a horrible tragedy. So, you know, it was like two feelings. You know, I was glad that I had all these opportunities. We went to Montreal, and I went to third year McGill immediately. You know, I was given 2-year credits, so everything went smoothly for me, but my parents were truly destroyed. So when I knew that the painting was purchased by a very good friend of my father's, because we couldn't take any possessions, we were literally told how many things we could take. And when I went to Poland in 2016 in October, I reconnected with the daughter of this man, and she just casually said, "Come, I show you the painting." And I had to like really connect with it. But then when you see the scene in the film, I was very emotionally moved, because it sort of put me in touch with our life in Poland, and particularly my parents, you know, our home and whatever life we had. And the quote you provided, it's not mine. It actually, it was by a Polish writer who wrote about Jews returning after the war to those empty towns and villages and not finding anything and searching for objects. And any object had a meaning and attested to the fact, as he said, that this world ever existed.
And we see that in so many ways in the film, even when you're getting a tour around Lodz and someone says, this tree might be the only thing that remains from that time. Or the juxtaposition of the number 63 on your family's house, Paul, the older version of the number, and then the newer version, the way that the city is interacting with its history. Paul, this was your second time going to Poland, and obviously your story is very different than Lilka's and also than Ronnie's. There's these different eras, and I want to come back to that in Jewish history in Poland that are explored in the film. how was this trip different for you, and what made you decide to go back with Lilka, and how did you meet her?
What made me come back to Poland in this thing uh, was the opportunity, the once in a lifetime opportunity to share through a film the story about my mom. All right, and what the trials and tribulations that she went through from the beginning of the war through the end of the war, and even before the war started, you know, because everybody had the sense that things were turning around the other way. There was anti-Semitism. You know, you could feel it. I'm sure you could. It was in the air. So I felt I was compelled to become a part of this movie, and you know, sometimes you only get an opportunity in life to do something once. So I wasn't going to let it.
How did you meet Slawomir and Lilka?
I met Slawomir through Lilka. First, I met Lilka. I met Lilka through a mutual acquaintance of ours from Livingston, New Jersey. And the acquaintance that I'm talking about, her family survived, actually were in the Warsaw Ghetto, all right? And she knew me, and she thought that it would be good for me to hook up with Lilka because we had something in common with the city of Lodz. So we met. I brought all kinds of artifacts with me. I was amazed when she first told me that she had a telephone book from Lodz back in 1939, 38, and she could find the address possibly of where my parents lived and where my mother lived along with her parents. So I found it very fascinating. I was very intrigued, and I became part of this film. And we sat. I gave her all kinds of photos, my mom's side, my dad's side, and that's what started it.
It's really, I mean, it's an interesting, and this is a question for you, Slawomir, about the choice to include Lilka, Paul, and Ronnie, and of course the images of Lodz today as sort of these eras. Do you think, you know, Ronnie's, who you'll meet in the film, her family left in 1926. Paul, your family left after the war. And of course, Lilka, you left in the 60s. And Slawomir, you left Poland yourself in the 80s. So do you think of these as distinct eras in Jewish identity in the city or in Poland? And why did you choose to sort of put these stories together in this film?
I mean, this was a challenge. We decided to have Lilka and Paul in the film, and then during our filming, I discovered online that Ronnie Ben-Ari exists, and Lilka joined me in an effort to convince her to join the film. We were not sure if it will work or not, but she simply lived in the same building, in the same address, and she is from Israel. And Lilka made an effort to convince her to come. I was not sure till the very end, until we finished filming or started filming. I would say that it will work, but it worked perfectly. So the film kind of evolved during the process, and I had one idea at the very beginning, which was just Lilka, and then the second was Lilka and Paul, and at the end of the film we have three characters: Ronnie, Lilka, and Paul, and how to put them together. And my idea was to use animation. Animation became a glue to bring these three characters together and to tell the story in more natural way. And as you may remember from Karski and the Lords of Humanity, I used animation there, and this was a very good experience. And I got a lot of applause for incorporating animation in documentary which deals with Holocaust. So in this case, I was pretty sure it will work. At Karski, it was experimentation, and I was not sure if will be successful. But anyway, this is how the film was made. We did many changes during the film. I can give you one very interesting example, because during the film, Lilka, who is an amazing researcher, found out details of our characters which we didn't know before. At the beginning of the film, I was told that the person who lived there during the war, the German guy, he was a dentist. So I had my crew of animators making drawings of a German dentist in the room, and he's there, and everything is completed. And suddenly Lilka comes and says, "Wait a moment, there's a historian," and she discovered that he was actually a carpenter, and the dentist was a Jewish woman who lived in this apartment before. So suddenly my animators had to change images from the German dentist to Jewish woman dentist.
Wow.
So this is an example of how the film was changing, and Lilka can jump on this, because there was even new discovery after the film was completed, which makes it even more interesting.
I'd love to hear it. I think it's probably pretty rare that the subject of your film becomes one of the lead researchers. So that's incredible. Lilka, what did you discover after the filming?
Well, it's interesting that the film has a little bit of, like, I wouldn't say afterlife, is the wrong word, but people who see the film are just truly amazed. Those who are interested in their own roots, because, there are only questions, there are very few answers. We never know enough. So we were very lucky. I partnered with a professor. We were very lucky because, I approached her and she turned out to be an amazing person who very doggedly found information from German tax records of who lived in this building. And we were able to find out that my apartment and everything in it, all the furniture, the painting included, was owned by this Jewish woman who was also a dentist, and she had a dental cabinet in one of the rooms. And not only that, we found out a lot about her, but Sławek and his team of animators, when you compare the actual photograph of this woman and what the animators did, it's pretty close. Right? It was quite amazing. But what is also, when the movie was already completed, and we found out that what we felt, that she died in the ghetto. She was taken to be murdered in a concentration camps together with her two sons. But when the movie was completed, we found out that the two sons actually survived the war. They came back to Łódź. I kind of even think that they came to see my parents, but my parents already lived in this particular apartment. So they went and established their own, apartments, and they stayed in Łódź until 1956, then where they immigrated to Israel. And right now, there is a family of 25 descendants living in Israel, United States, who I am all in touch with. They shared with me the photograph of the actual subjects, and they found out a lot they didn't know about the grandmother. So it was quite gratifying from this perspective.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, the sort of life that comes out of this building and out of this city and out of the paint, there's just so much there. I guess, as you sort of said, the objects hold whole histories, and the building, it sounds like, does too. I was also very impressed that, when you identified the dentist chair as being of that era, it was clear that you had done quite a bit of research. I want to go back to the animation, because one of the things I really loved was the animation of the painting, because here's a painted object. The idea of animating a painting I thought was really interesting, and it's the way it moved gave it life. And I think I was struck. I mean, there are the scenes in the beginning, Lilka, where you go and visit the painting, but we don't really see it close up until 40 minutes in. I'd love to hear about your choice of sort of, I think we sort of get closer to the objects as the film unravels. Was that a conscious choice not to show it to us until we're sort of almost halfway into the movie?
No, yes, it was my directorial choice to leave some kind of suspense what this painting is really about. But I introduced it through animation at the beginning, and at the end, bringing the painting back to the room where we could find a hole in the wall where actually the painting hanged 75 years, 50 years ago, which is amazing, and we were able to put it back in the same place. So yes, those were editorial or directorial choices to have a closure, to have this journey ended with a full circle where Lilka brings the painting back to the house, to the apartment. Yes.
And I love that Lilka, you talk about the circle coming out of the curtain that as a kid you didn't know what it was, and that still remains a mystery, I think, to us. So there's all of these objects, all of these stories still have so much mystery behind them, some gaps that we'll never be able to fill in.
True.
I was taken by that. You came. Your connection to the story is this painting, is this object. It felt almost as though there were different levels of connection. You connected to the object. Ronnie was very connected to the walls of the building, and Paul, you were visiting the city. And it felt very different the way that you were exploring the city, looking at places that were no longer. You were at a cemetery. You were in places that were about the Holocaust. I think in Lilka, you were revisiting places of childhood. Paul, did your connection to the city change after this trip? After seeing it together with Lilka, who had lived there after the war?
Absolutely. I became, my first trip to Poland was a prelude about 12 years ago, and got to see a little bit of everything, and it kind of broke the ice for me emotionally. I knew it was going to be a very difficult trip, but being this trip was specifically for the city of Lodz, and I got to see where my mom actually grew up, in the suburb of Lodz, about 15 minutes outside of Lodz. And so it became, I became very, very intrigued by the whole thing. And, I saw the church in Lodz where my mom was one of 4,500 Jews that were rounded up, and they were held there in the church for approximately 24 to 36 hours until the Nazis did the research to find out who would be useful as far as skilled labor and who would be used at the Lodz ghetto. Those that were skilled labor went to the Lodz ghetto. Those who were not, they went to Chelmo, and they were exterminated there by the gas vans. So just it was very emotional for me, but I kept everything in check because I've already been there 12 years prior. So, and another part that was very emotional for me when I was at the train station. There's one monument there that I'm leaning against. It was the monument for Gross Rosen. Gross Rosen was the labor camp, which my father was from Celts. My father was he was an inhabitant of the Gross Rosen camp, and Gross Rosen was one of the camps that probably had the worst conditions out of any. It was basically a rock quarry, and the Nazis made you walk down into the quarry, down about 200 steps, 300 steps. They would make you drag a rock up the steps, put it down, and then you have to carry another one down. They would just work you to death. And the other thing they they made the Jews grind stone without a mask. So you were breathing in all of that and everything, and just horrible. It's one of the reasons why my father had emphysema, in his later years and everything. So being there at the station and getting to just holding on to that monument outside against the wall there, I was just thinking about everything that my dad went through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's some
In
questions coming
addition
in
to
from the
being on the
audience.
top of the,
There's some questions coming in from the audience, and one of them relates to this. So I would love to tie, because we don't have much more time. And there's a question specifically from Ted Ryback about you, asking you and Lilka to share more about the background of your father. So you're talking about your father's story now, and I would love to hear from both of you and answer Ted's question. And maybe also, if you can talk a little bit about the way your parents shared their stories with you, because I'm curious if your the stories you heard about about your parents' childhood and obviously interrupted lives in Poland was different than Lilka, who lived in Poland growing up.
Well, I know Ted. Hello, Ted. I know Ted. Ted is responsible for us being actually in Massachusetts. We moved here from Toronto. Hello, Ted and Ella. Anyways, thank you kindly for asking. Yes, in the film, there's a lot about Paul's mom, who was in the Lodz ghetto, which was in horrific conditions. And also about my mother, who was in hiding 2.5 years in a small kind of a space created by these kind people. But my father also was a Holocaust survivor. He was the only survivor of a very large family, close to maybe, 120 people. He had like 10 brothers, and they all had families. And also my father had a wife and 2 children who were murdered at Treblinka. And my father, with a group of 12 other Jews from the town where he was born, which is about 100 kilometers north of Lodz, between Lodz and Warsaw, they actually hid in the woods around this area. And they also survived because they were helped by local population. In other words, you couldn't survive in hiding in the forest or anywhere you were trying to hide unless you had help. It was impossible. And of course, my father, I recently found out that they had a gun, and made me feel better, So I met all these people who were in this group of 12. They were like brothers. My father was very attached to this group. Some of them lived in Israel, some of them lived in Canada, and some in the States, later in Sweden. So my father was like also a hero because he helped other Jews survive. There were many stories about that, but he never talked about it, ever. Well, my mother talked about it, wrote a book. She wrote a diary during her hiding. The diary was published as a book. Then it was performed off of Broadway as a one-woman play. It's still, being widely read. And my mother was just like forever talking about it, but my father never. And, I just want to say that we children of Holocaust survivors, and myself, being so directly connected to Poland, our parents were totally destroyed by the experience, and they functioned after the war. My parents were 12, the 12th survivor of this town of 1,500 people, and they functioned. They went on to work and create lives and had children, but they were ultimately totally destroyed by the experience. And I think all the energy, all the stuff they had, they gave it to survive because they were on the outside, So that's about my parents. It's still a very touchy subject for me.
And Paul, you grew up with these stories from your parents. Did they talk about this period when you were young or as you got older?
My mom spoke randomly about certain things, okay? And my father would come out and talk to me about things that happened to him. Like he would describe it like it happened yesterday, you know, and my father had so many stories, you know. And you know, my father was in Auschwitz. He was in Birkenau at the end of the war. He was on top of the pile practically, you know. And he told us one story about how there was one Ukrainian guard in Birkenau he was terrible. He had a bayonet. He would come into the stalag, and for no reason at all, he would just start poking everybody with the bayonet. So what happened one night, it must have been December 1944, somewhere coming towards the end of the war, the inmates, they just started to get sick and tired of this guy, and they were waiting for him to come in, and they jumped him from the back. And this is a big guy. He was about 6'3", and they jumped him from the back. They pinned him down. They took a broomstick. They put it on his throat, and they jumped on the broomstick. The man's tongue came flying out. And what did they do with him? They opened up the floor, and they put him in the cooler. And that's what happened. But this is one of the many stories that
so you grew up hearing these stories from your parents.
Yeah. Oh yes.
Yeah.
Many stories.
So I think we
stories
just have time
for everything.
Yeah. I see why, you know, it took you I think you went back for the first time 5 years before this film was shot, you said. So I see why it took you a while to revisit Poland. There's a question here from Ronald Baruch, and we are wrapping up, unfortunately, but I want to also ask you about where the film is going. But there's a question about Poland today and whether it's becoming more anti-Semitic than you thought previously. And maybe what your experience was filming this very Jewish film in Poland a few years ago.
The question, if Poland is more anti-Semitic now than it was before, I think what's happening now, the voices of anti-Semitism are louder, are also in mainstream media. It didn't change. Poland was same anti-Semitic 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and when Lilka lived there. So the only change is that the current government is allowing these voices to be in mainstream media, and we can read about this publicly. You heard about Polish historians, Barbara Engelking and Jan Grabowski, who had to apologize for the Holocaust book. There is a lot of stories of that kind which are happening now, and there is a self-censorship among filmmakers like myself. If I would live in Poland, I probably wouldn't do this film because of this reason. So that's the change. Maybe Lilka, you want to add your thought?
Well, I just briefly want to say that people who survived the war in Poland, it was such a traumatic experience that some of them didn't go back to the Jewish identity. It was very common to maintain the Christian name because some of them changed, the papers and so on. And they actually were so traumatized, that they continued, not as Jews. But I lived in a completely Jewish environment. We were openly Jews. I went to a Jewish school, another film Sławek made about our Jewish school in Łódź. And, I never had any complexes about it. I really don't know why. I was openly, my last name was not Polish, so they knew right away. But we had a group, we were in a community. So I personally have not experienced, anti-Semitism until 1968, and when we had to leave. But even if I go back now, I realize that, there's this open right-wing kind of a bias and populistic view of Polish society is always being blamed for things, and now Jews are obviously blaming them for collaboration during the war. But, I look at Poland as individual people, and I have great friends there. When I go back to the same people. And, even if I encounter something about Jews, being an American, I really don't care that much, It's just like, it is there. It was always there. But, there are good and bad people like everywhere. But Poland has an incredibly painful history of anti-Semitism, almost, I would say, an obsession about Jews, which, I don't know, they need a collective code, a psychiatrist couch to do it. But it is not like in other Eastern European countries. I mean, at least like it was. I was in Czech Republic, and Hungary is now very right-wing and also anti-Semitic. But in Poland, it's out there. It's like very obvious. Although, it is not that meaningful to me, because I have very good friends, and I have this debt to the Polish people who saved my mother. So, yes, I acknowledge it, but it is what it is, basically.
And this film is just opening now and screening in the US. Has it screened yet in Poland?
It had a premiere in Łódź, actually. The very first screening of the film before it was re-edited to this new version, screened in November of 2019. Few places, including Łask, where Paul mother was taken to Łódź ghetto from. So it had few screenings, but they were kind of unnoticed, I would say. And now I think after all the screenings, we have screenings in 35 movie theaters in the United States at this moment. I think the film will come back to Poland with a different power and with the fame of being very successful in the United States. Usually things happen that way. If anything is successful in US, then it looked at differently than it was originally.
Well, I'm sure there'll be a very different perspective also watching it. There would be watching it in a theater, hopefully back in a live theater in Lodz when it does open up again there. Thank you to everyone who's here tonight for joining us, and thank you, Slawomir, Lilka, and Paul, for sharing these incredible stories with us through your family stories with us through this film, and then for being with us here tonight. I believe the film is continuing to screen at the Coolidge at least for a week, so tell your friends to watch it, and if they continue watching through the Coolidge, hopefully it will stay on longer here, but also if you want to share the website for the film, people can find out where it's going next. It's stillifeinlodz.com?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you again for being here. Thank you to the Coolidge for hosting this event, and thank you everyone for joining tonight. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.